Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement podcast, powered by SIG. And earlier in the year, you might recall that Mark Raffan of the Negotiations Ninja podcast, he joined me on the show and we talked about all things negotiation. Well, Mark invited me onto the Negotiations Ninja podcast itself to talk about cost savings. And so, as you'll hear in the intro, we actually decided to run Mark's interview with me simultaneously on both Art of Procurement and on Negotiations Ninja. So what follows is, I think it's a first for what I've done on the show. It's somebody interviewing me on my own podcast. I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to run the recording from Mark's interview with me, and then I'll be back again next week with another great interview. So with that said, let's go straight into the pod.
Hey, Phil, how are you?
Mark, I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Really, really good. Things are bright and sunny. It's a gorgeous 23 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but
no, I've forgotten. So I should know, being a Brit, and now I've been Americanized for too long.
Yeah, no. In Canada, we definitely follow the British system.
Yeah, I know 23 degrees. If I was home in England, would be summer, and being here in Southern California is like, meh.
Yeah, you need a sweater.
It's like 7 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm stoked, man. It's finally time for me to get a little bit of rest. I'm going on vacation soon, so I'm happy about that. Hitting Mexico, nice. And you've been really busy lately, traveling all over the place. Yeah,
it's been pretty crazy. You know, one of the things that the podcast really has enabled me the opportunity to do is go to a lot of events. And, I enjoy going to them, one, for meeting people, meeting listeners, meeting kind of thought leaders, learning myself. And, I've had the opportunity to present at a few things as well. And that's always a learning experience for me too. Doing a podcast, I don't want to say it's really easy, because it's not. That's kind of making it seem like it's easier than it is. But when you sat in front of a microphone and a computer screen, there isn't quite the pressure as when you're sitting in a room and you're trying to articulate the same things in a conference setting. And I still really struggle with that sometimes. So I kind of take the opportunity to go and do things like that so I can grow myself and try not to be too hard on myself at the same time when I reflect on how they went.
Totally. And speaking in front of people is tough.
Yeah, it doesn't come natural at all. And it's just something I'm learning, and you have your good days, you have your bad days, and you just try and take the things from, how can I improve the next time?
Love it. And so for the listeners, Phil and I are going to do a joint podcast.
Yeah.
We're going to be publishing this at the same time.
Yeah, it's the first time we've done something like that. So, we thought that this was a topic that would be of interest to Art of Procurement listeners as well. We're going to talk a little bit about some procurement issues, and, why not? Why not publish these at the same time on both pods and see if we can have as many folks engage in the content as possible.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. We're going to get started on the conversation about cost reduction, cost avoidance, basically cost savings in general. Mm-hmm. We're really speaking to the procurement folks in this one, but for the salespeople that are listening, it's good for you to know sort of what the procurement guys and gals face on their end when it comes to targets, understanding what to hit, what's the difference between a cost reduction and cost avoidance. That's a big one. And so for a lot of salespeople, I think this would be super interesting as well.
Yeah, me too. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it gives an insight into how the people that you're dealing with, if you're a salesperson, how are they incented? How's their performance incented? Because I think that's so important to understanding behavior and how to position some of the things that you're doing. So hopefully there's something in this for everybody.
Yeah, I think there will be. Let's kick it off. So I think first and foremost, we need to try and define savings a little bit better. And so there's some major buckets of savings that we have. We have cost reduction, cost avoidance.
Yeah.
We have savings related to operational efficiency and efficient processing and maybe new materials. But let's start with the top two. What's the
Yeah.
major difference you think between cost reduction and cost avoidance?
Yeah, and I can speak a little bit about how those are calculated later, but generally, cost reduction is spend that you spent last year that you're not going to spend this year, and cost avoidance is a hypothetical. So it can be perhaps there was a price increase that you negotiated down, or there was an RFP process that you ran for something that as your company has never bought before, that you negotiated the prices down from the first RFP to the last contract. So that's really the difference between the two.
Yeah, I think probably the most common area where people see cost avoidance is if they get a vendor that, puts in an increase for 5% and they say no, and then there's no increase. That is the very most typical cost avoidance in my mind.
Yeah, negotiating. So there may be, and it could be that there's a cost of living adjustment in a contract of 3% or whatever it may be, and you go and negotiate that away at the end of a particular year for whatever reason. That's 3% savings, but that's only cost avoidance because you didn't pay that last year.
That's right. Yeah, there's no actual money saved.
Right.
Yeah, and then cost reduction is really X this year and then X minus 1 next year, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, you think of cost reduction as something that a CFO, so long as that cost reduction was captured, the CFO can see that on the bottom line. A CFO can never see cost avoidance on the taken out of his cash flow.
Well, I think that's interesting. So let's dive into the CFO thing, because I think CFOs have a big role when it comes to cost reduction and cost avoidance. Mm-hmm. How do you think CFOs view the differences between the two, and do they really care about cost avoidance?
Most CFOs, in my experience, don't care about cost avoidance. This is a big topic. There's probably a few places I could go with it, but as a procurement profession, we like to use cost avoidance if we can. I think at least with our traditional thinking of how can we maximize the perceived ROI of our function, because cost avoidance is relatively easy to claim and it's very hard to measure, at least whether it impacted the bottom line or not. So a lot of what we do, honestly, is reducing or negotiating away cost increases. Or when we're buying something new, it's getting the best deal in an RFP process. So for us, it's really part and parcel of everything that we do. And we say as procurement folks that if we're not incented to save money, what is the incentive? And there's you can carry that down to people perhaps making decisions that aren't the best decisions for the company. From a CFO perspective, they look at that and say, well, there's not really I don't see any impact. So why should I be enabling you to save when I don't see the dollars hitting my bottom line? You as a procurement leader can come and report to me that you've saved $10 million. I may have only seen 3 million of that. So that means I don't really believe the delta. Or if I only see 3 and you've telling me you've saved 10 because you've included cost avoidance, I don't really trust your numbers at all.
Yeah.
I would say, studies. I was at a conference just yesterday, the day before, when we were recording here, and there was a stat that was put up on the screen in one of the sessions that about 30% of organizations actually still use cost avoidance, but the majority are going away and recognizing that it's not really a good way of building credibility and building trust in the numbers that you present to finance.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think even on the cost reduction side, there's this delayed gratification that the finance team gets because procurement's claiming savings, let's say at the beginning of a contract, saying, hey, we saved $3 million on this contract in cost reduction. But they only see that because it's tracked, annually. Let's just say, for example, they only see that at the end of the year.
Yeah, and the other thing to take into account into what a CFO may see from a cost reduction perspective is, are those reductions realized reductions, or are they budgeted or projected reductions? So you can sign a new contract with a supplier that perhaps gets you a hard dollar, so a cost reduction, real money, real cash in the bank, and you project the impact of that over a 12-month period. But if you're only projecting it, you don't really know if people have complied with buying the products or buying the service that are part of that contract. The volume's holding up to what you said they were going to be. They could be less, they could even be more. But there's a lot of variables that go into whether still that being a cash cost reduction is saved versus realized savings, which is essentially going into an invoice line level detail every single month and saying, okay, I can connect the new deal with actual purchases invoiced for, and then show actual savings that were realized. And you can track then what happened to those savings. Were they reinvested in the business? Did they hit the bottom line? But there's a path that shows, yes, those did happen. And this is what happened with that cash. And that's really where you get the most, I would say, buy-in from a CFO, or most trust in the numbers when you're showing that these are actual real numbers.
Totally. It would be interesting, and I don't know, maybe you've seen this, it would be interesting to see the difference between budgeted cost savings and realized cost savings on average across companies.
Yeah, and there's a number of different stats, I think probably all over the map, of how much of anticipated cost savings actually gets realized, and I think it's somewhere around 60%. So there's a big leakage of savings that you expect versus savings that realize. Back in my past, I delivered some outsourcing services within the procurement space, and part of our deals included doing realized savings tracking. And I would say 8 or 9 times out of 10, when you do realized savings, the volumes that you see are less than what you anticipated at the beginning. But those 1 or 2, there may be projects where the volumes significantly increased versus what the projection was. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that the end result is that much different. It's just that the makeup of where those savings came from differs from what the initial projection was, and it just gives a bit more trust in the data.
And it might not necessarily just be volumes either. I mean, a large part of it, in my experience, has come down to management of the contract as well.
Right. No, and that's true. It's, do you then start to have rogue spend? So do you have people who, you may have put a contract in place and that contract isn't necessarily fit for purpose. So people are going around the contract and spending with their favorite provider, even though that's not the provider you contracted with, which is one of the reasons why the volumes may be much lower than what you anticipated.
Yeah, exactly. And so when we get into the calculation of savings, there's often an argument in procurement circles around, should we be calculating savings on a 1-year annualized approach, or should it be like a multi-year average, or how do you think people should calculate savings?
So in my experience, it's been 12-month annualized savings where it's just where the reduction is clear, and it's a reduction for the coming 12-month period. And even if the reduction may be for the life of the contract, but it may be the same reduction. So let's say something cost me $100. I negotiated it to $97 for the rest of the contract. The contract may be may have 3 years left of that contract. I'm just going to take the $3 of savings for the first year, because in year 2, it's still going to be $97. In year 3, it's still going to be $97. But you could have a case where you negotiate from $100 to $97 in the first year, but then you build in some stepped reductions for the rest of the contract. So perhaps year 2 is going to go from 97 to 95, and year 3 is going to go from 95 to 93. So the first year you're claiming the difference between 100 to 97. The second year you can claim the difference between 97 being the new baseline and 95 being the new price. And then the third year the same. You reset the baseline at 95 and you claim the delta between the 95 and the 93 in your third year. So it really depends on the nature of the deal that you've negotiated.
Yeah, I think the 12-month annualized approach is probably the most conservative approach, and I think it's probably the safest, because when you start talking about multi-year savings, that's I think where procurement loses a lot of credibility because we're saying, hey, we saved all this money over the next 5 years, and it's not real, really.
Well, but so it's not real if you just do a one-time cost reduction, but if you have a contract which reduces cost year over year, then those are real numbers.
Totally agree with that.
And I see that more in direct procurement versus indirect. So perhaps you're buying. I worked in automotive in the past, buying a bunch of things. Well, let's just say you're buying a light bulb that goes into the front of a Cadillac for the next 5 years, and you negotiate pricing to be reduced every single year. then that's real price reductions every single year that impacts the company. And so yes, you claim those because it's not like you claim them all in year one, but you can claim it over the life of the volume because you've negotiated annual cost reductions associated with it.
Yeah, exactly. And so do you think procurement, because I think there's a difference. We talked about realized savings versus budgeted savings earlier. Do you think that procurement should be capturing the realized savings, or do you think that they should be capturing the budgeted savings now that we know what the stats are?
My own personal opinion is we should, but I say we should, it's very difficult to do this for most organizations. Realized savings are really the way to go, in my opinion, because as a function, we want to go away from being a black box, and being the masters of our own data. We want as much transparency as possible, because then that gives more trust and respect and understanding of what we're doing as well. Realized savings, I mean, you can't really argue about realized savings because they're based on invoices. And yes, there may be some calculations that make some assumptions, especially when you're buying things that are a high volume, like stationery or MRO, supplies where you've just got so many SKUs that it's really hard to go and look at a line by line basis. So you take a market basket, but applying realized savings actually shows the real impact of what you're doing from a cost savings perspective. Assumes that cost savings is the only measure that we should have, but assuming that cost savings will always be so important, realized is at least from a working with the rest of the business, in my opinion, is the way to go. But it's very hard. I say very hard. It's time consuming to do that.
It is time consuming because you do have to go into that line level detail, right?
Yes. Yeah. And that's where I see the opportunity for technology to really automate that process as much as possible. I don't really see anybody doing that particularly at the moment. Well, I see it on the direct side because it's relatively straightforward because the inputs are relatively limited. I don't see anybody from a technology perspective really doing that on the indirect side when there's a lot more complexity in terms of the scope and what you're buying and the range of options that could be on a particular invoice. That's where it gets a lot harder. But it would be, I imagine it's only a matter of time before that does exist, and that would make that process a lot easier, a lot less time consuming.
Yeah, I totally agree. Do you think there are like easy ways or knock out of the park ways to generate savings that most people do that we can share with the listeners?
Honestly, no. Well, I say no. I say no because there's no single answer. I don't think to that question. A lot of it depends on the maturity of your procurement function. So if you're a function that has relatively low maturity from a procurement perspective, at least from a strategic procurement perspective, then honestly, you're going to find a lot of savings. The first time that you put in place strategic sourcing or category management and bring in market intelligence, have some subject matter experts, you're going to find, 10 to 30% more than likely. In individual cases, it might be a lot more than that, just through the application of what I'd call more strategic procurement processes and capabilities. Now, if you're in an organization where you're really firing on all cylinders, it's obviously not that easy because those, I don't like the term low-hanging fruit. I can't think of anything better to say at the moment. So I take all those low-hanging fruit have gone, then it's much harder. And then it's all about, managing costs more strategically, understanding your input costs, using cost modeling, looking at demand management, understanding the cost that you actually place on a supplier to be your supplier, figuring out if there's new delivery models, starting to think about outcomes and impact versus just pure cost. So it really depends on where you are as an organization in terms of how easy it is to generate savings. And obviously it gets harder over time once you take out those lower hanging fruit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the more mature you get, the more you need to focus on operational savings and demand management and ways to generate savings that way than you do straight on the price negotiation.
Yeah, and you focus. That's right. At the low end of the maturity, it's often around it's, as you say, price, and it's leverage based. So you're just going and you're leveraging suppliers against each other. You're doing your competitive bidding, and that on its own can generate some pretty substantial savings when it's not been when you've not taken that approach before. But you can only really do that once. And you've also got to be careful how you do that, because you don't want to do that in a way. This is what I see a lot of procurement organizations do. They do this in a way which is too aggressive. And so it creates a lot of friction, both between the procurement team and their stakeholders, but also the procurement team and their supply bases, in that when you're actually wanting to move up that value curve, you've actually damaged a lot of the relationships that you now need to rely on when you think about other ways to create value, both from a cost management perspective, but also when you start thinking about innovation too.
Yeah, it's a series of diminishing returns, essentially. I mean, the more and more you grind, the less and less money they have to put into research or any kind of value that they want to generate for your organization.
Right. And, it depends on what you're buying, because sure, there's some markets where it's just a commoditized product, but you've got to be really careful in terms of how important is the products or the services that a particular supplier is providing to you as part of your competitive advantage, and really what kind of approach do you want to be taking, and how aggressively do you want to be working with the suppliers who are really going to be fundamental to your growth as an organization. You want to become a customer of choice to those organizations rather than just going with a stick and trying to beat them up for some cost savings the first time round, because there may be a bunch that exist, but you got to do that in a more considered way than just kind of being more aggressive and not taking the bigger picture into account of that relationship you want with the supplier.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's where, procurement organizations, we talk about this a lot, focus on getting more strategic. There's a case of, I know a lot of procurement organizations that are just really focusing on productivity mm-hmm. of the labor base, productivity of the contractor base. One example in particular, it was just super simple example, but it worked so well, is there was a vendor that was being worked, and the washroom for that vendor on an industrial site was a 15-minute walk away. And so they calculated the loss of productive time with that washroom walk, and they just placed a porta potty close to their work site right. and increased the productivity tenfold, Yeah. And so you're in a situation where you're no longer grinding on price, but you're focused on how you can make the workforce more productive. Yeah,
being able to think like that goes back to incentives, though. So as an organization, like, how are your team incented? How is savings measured for that group? Will they be able to claim that as a saving? And if they're not, then it maybe takes away some of the incentive to think outside the box, which is why I really encourage procurement leaders to think about how can they have more of a balanced scorecard in terms of what they measure and how people are rewarded. So you're thinking about the outcomes you want to drive, as opposed to it just being all about cost savings. And for sure, some organizations, they're part in the business cycle where for better or worse, it is all about cost savings for them. But most businesses aren't in that perpetually, in that mode. So you really, there's just so much benefit in trying to encourage other ways to think about managing even cost over and above just looking at what did we pay last year versus what did we pay this year.
Totally agree. You were talking about demand management as well. How do you think demand management plays into cost savings?
So demand management is really important. I mean, it's something that we often forget about, or we don't really attack until we've gone through that first process of seeing where there's some low-hanging fruit. But, do we even need to spend the money at all? Or, as I think about ways that you can approach demand management, it's, are you buying do you even need what you're buying is the most basic one. But then is what we're buying, are we scoping it in a way that's over-engineered, because we're wanting to buy the Rolls Royce when we don't really need a Rolls Royce, but a lot of stakeholders want the best that they can get rather than what they actually need, what's fit for purpose. So actually managing scope is a form of demand management. Can you use substitute products or services? So do we even need to go, should we be focusing on the outcome more than how we're going to get the outcome? And does that change what supplier you need, what products you might be able to use, whatever it may be? in getting that outcome, that would be a form of looking at demand management. Another thing to think about is, are we placing too much requirements on suppliers in terms of their metrics? Are those metrics too aggressive? And it could be that, let's say for an internal call center, you require 99.9% of phone calls to be picked up within 3 rings. Whereas because it's an internal call center, you may be okay if it's 90% or it's 80% or it's 95%, pick a number, but we've just scoped it to be 99.9 because that's best in class. And therefore we're paying for a bunch more people to be sat waiting for the phone to ring than you would if you relaxed some of those metrics. So, things like that really go into what's the cost of to a service provider of providing the service that you want, and what can you do to help kind of reduce that cost? Because that's all ways of saving money through demand versus just the traditional negotiation approach.
That's super interesting. I've never actually thought of overscoping SLAs.
Yeah, there's one other I thought of, which was, as I was just kind of talking there, is policy. Do you have can you put policy in place, or can you put certain approval levels for certain products or services? Again, they'll just go into managing some of the demand so that the business isn't going out and buying whatever they want, whenever they want it. That's a good, I see it in market research a lot. Different areas of the business go and buy market research for their own purposes, and they're all buying stuff that somewhere else in the company already has. They've already bought, or they've bought something very, very similar, or commissioned something very, very similar. So just kind of taking stock of what you're actually buying. Are you duplicating your purchases? All those kind of things all roll into demand management, and they're not easy, which is why I say we sometimes jump over that as when we're in the early stages of a procurement transformation. But when you look at opportunities to save, especially for those that are a bit more mature, there is a lot of opportunity in demand management.
Good points. Really good points. Awesome. Man, we've covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. Is there anything else that you think the listeners need to know about?
There's a couple of things that, as I thought about this topic, one is, why do we even have savings as a metric to start with? Because I think from a procurement perspective, sometimes we've become our own worst enemy. And, savings are relatively easy to measure, aside from everything else we talked about, compared to some of the other measures that you might have. But we used savings to, as the way to get investment in our function over the last 20 years, because it was a relatively straightforward way to build a business case, to show an ROI for investment in procurement as a function. And so I think we've conditioned the organizations around us to think that savings is the metric that they should measure us on, versus that's the measure that we have to be measured on. So I just wanted to make the point that it's not, we assume that that's how people want to measure us, but that might not exactly be how people want to measure us. I've talked to some CPOs about their relationship with a CFO. And the first thing that most of those people say is, look, my CFO really doesn't care that. He doesn't go to bed thinking about cost savings. That's not, yes, he's interested in cost management, but cost savings isn't his number one metric. So you start to understand what really is important to your organization rather than assuming. That may change how you look at how you're measuring the value that your team can actually create, as opposed to just assuming that, hey, we've got to use cost savings as a measure because that's the only way the business knows how to measure us.
And maybe we haven't done enough critical thinking to think of how we should be measured in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. That for us, it's about, if we just kind of unlearn that bias of cost savings is the way that we're measured, and you see it everywhere. It's all about cost savings. So it's so inherently built into what we do that we just take it as a fact. If we actually take a step back and think about, what are other ways that we could measure our performance? There are other companies that are measuring performance in other ways from their procurement team. It's not always about cost savings. So I think it just gives some food for thought about how we can position our value prop and how we can start the conversation with those people in the business that pay our bills. Ultimately, what's important to them, and it may be different than what we assume.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Cool. Anything else?
I guess the last thing, which kind of segues into that a little bit, is we talked about cost savings, but it's the whole notion of value beyond savings. Value beyond savings is something that we as a procurement function, or at least subsets of the procurement function, have been talking about for a long time. As we struggle to find ways that we can define or demonstrate the value that we create over and above cost savings, because of that whole kind of incentive structure. We don't actually want to necessarily be incented to be going and being aggressive with our suppliers to take every last penny out of every last deal that we possibly can find. We want to be bringing value to the business in other ways. So we're starting to think, how can we build metrics that still allow us to demonstrate the value we create, but they're not 100% based on cost savings. Yeah. My experience is that you got to start small. So some of the metrics to think about, it's like, there's a company that I know have a very interesting metric around, and it's kind of similar to what you said. It's the hours that are saved. How much time are they saving their stakeholders by actually managing the process on their behalf? Because they're in a high growth industry, they pay their people an awful lot of money, and it would be very hard to replace some of those people. So saving them time is actually a really great driver of value for them. There's things like Net Promoter Score. There's cycle times. When I think of cycle times, it's upstream. So it's how quickly are we enabling our organization to go to market because we have a shorter sourcing process, for example. All those things can build into more of a balanced scorecard, I would say.
Yeah.
And I just encourage people to think about what measures could go into that, and then start small. Make 90% of your goal savings in year one and 10% these other measures, and then take it to 80% and 20% in year two. And ultimately you may get to some parity where cost savings isn't the only driver.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think it has to line up with the overall objectives of the business as well. I once worked in a logistics function, and the primary motive is cycle times, right? I mean, anything that you can do to increase the asset turnover that's primary, because if trucks aren't moving, if trains aren't moving, then we're not making money. Yeah. So if the negotiation is going to be protracted and long and drawn out, that's not necessarily what they're interested in. They're interested in getting the product up, moving quickly. Yep.
No, that's so important. And it reminds me of my experiences in terms of cost savings versus other measures. I've been in a number of organizations where the CPO and their team have succeeded. They've blown away their savings target, but they get let go because they've lost all their internal support because the way they went about it, and they upset the suppliers, they upset the stakeholders in doing basically saving money at all costs. And then on the flip side, I've seen a number of examples where cost has been the primary measure, and a CPO and their team haven't achieved their goals. And it's not like they've not achieved them by 75% or anything. Let's say they're 10, they're 20% short of their goals. But they have the support of the executive peers who are all talking about the work that their group has done in positioning that group, that function, that product line, whatever it may be, in supporting their ultimate objectives, because they're seen as being an important part of that team. And I haven't seen a CPO be let go in those circumstances. So it's just kind of a message that even if savings is your driver, obviously we don't lose sight of it, but we can blow away our savings target and still not have the place in the organization which we all kind of strive and aspire to have.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Awesome. Great conversation, Phil.
Yeah. Well, thanks for inviting me on, Mark. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat about this.
Yeah, no, it's been awesome. And likewise, thanks for agreeing to do a joint sort of release of this. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah,
so,
awesome.
And it's interesting being interviewed on, I guess it'll be interviewed on my own pod as well, given the fact that it goes out on both of them. So all part of the ongoing experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. For the listeners, if you don't already know about Phil, at least for the Negotiations Ninja listeners, you need to check out his podcast at Art of Procurement. And he's probably the best, if not the most knowledgeable guy, and has the greatest guests on his podcast when it comes to procurement.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'm blushing here on the other side of the microphone, but thank you for your kind words. And also for Art of Procurement listeners, check out Mark's podcast, which I hope that I'm not going to get this wrong. Negotiation.ninja. Is that right?
Yeah, negotiations.ninja. That's
negotiations. Right. I never know whether it's the negotiation or negotiations with the S on the end of it. So negotiationsninja.com.
It's all good. It's all good.
Appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, absolutely, Phil. Listen, thanks very much. Have a great weekend. Hope you get some rest from all your travels.
We'll see.
And we'll be in touch soon. Thanks, bud.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mark. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.